Okay, this video will be on fallacies of ambiguity as part of Philosophy 1290 Critical Thinking at the University of Manitoba. You can see there, looking straight into the camera, the very eloquent, or depending on your perspective, evil Bill Clinton explaining that he had not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky, is the quote. And it turned out after the fact that when he very sincerely, in his very 90s way, said that, he meant the very precise legal definition of sexual relations, which was uh, physical intercourse and not sort of fooling around, right? And when we found out that fooling around happened, well, then that was the scandal of the day. By the standards of 2020, not a scandal at all, but by the standards of the 1990s, people got excited about that. So now, why do I start off with that? Well, he's being deliberately ambiguous. I think that Bill knew what he was doing. He was using those words in a way that he could say, I told the truth, even if it later turned out that, well, if his secret came out, he could still say, well, I meant this very precise meaning. The fact that I let the people who heard it think everything was on the up and up, that's neither here nor there. So that's how being ambiguous, how lack of clarity in meaning can affect someone's ability to persuade. So we're going to break ambiguity fallacies down into 5 general categories. Equivocation, which is the ambiguity in words, or often just a single word. Amphiboly is when the ambiguity or the lack of clarity is in the way the sentence is put together, in its grammar or its construction. Uh, Ambiguity of accent is when how you pronounce or how you emphasize things, it creates the ambiguity. And then 2 categories that we'll sort of look at together, composition and division. That's ambiguity of division or set membership, distribution. So when you talk about things in parts and wholes, that's going to be ambiguity of distribution. So we'll jump right into it with equivocation. Equivocation means is a word we use for using words with unclear or multiple meanings. In comedy, often we have a double entendre, which is 2 intentions or double speak. So this is just an example of equivocation. Thank you for thank you for your manuscript. I shall lose no time in reading it. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that person's going to read it right away? Or does it mean they're going to never read it? That's, I suggest, a deliberate ambiguity in how that works. So, and a much more entertaining example, the entire premise of the very famous comedy skit, Who's on First, is exactly an equivocation on on whether who is a person's name or whether it's used as part of the question, who's on first. So um, that's equivocation, a single word that has um, unclear meaning. So when we talk about a fallacy of equivocation, this is when we use that lack of clarity as a part of an argument. And so you have the form where you can see that the meaning changes from the premise to the conclusion. So for example, the fine said, fine for parking here, and so fine, I parked there. Now, that word fine, does that mean okay, or does that mean there will be a ticket on your windshield when you come back? That meaning is potentially ambiguous. And so when we want to disentangle these in ordinary language, we'd rely on the principal charity. Remember, the principal charity is that you rely on the meaning or the interpretation that is the most reasonable. Now, looking up at a sign on the street side that says fine for parking here, and you think, okay, you're not relying on the principle of charity. That the sign makes no sense that way. The sign only makes sense if you interpret it as you would be expecting a fiscal cost for parking there. Maybe as a counterexample, remember counterexamples are if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true violators. So in this case, we have true premises leading to a false conclusion. Nothing is better than steak, but spam is better than nothing, so spam is better than steak. Now, what do we think is wrong with that argument? Now, there's some, vegetarians and other people are going to argue that the first premise is contentious. Accept that. But for a person who accepts, right, for the sake of the argument, if we granted the truth of the conclusion that nothing is better than steak and spam is better than nothing, and the meaning of that is that eating that weird concoction of spiced ham in a can is better than having no food at all. Marginally, perhaps, but let's. So now, do we think that spam is better than steak? Well, the vegetarians are out of the picture on this because we're just comparing one form of meat to another. But for those that have an appetite for meat, I'm not sure they're going to prefer spam. So the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And what's going on here, of course, is that nothing doesn't mean the same thing in these two sentences. When I say nothing is better than steak, I'm basically saying of the many choices you could have, none are better. The meaning in the second sentence is nothing whatsoever. There's no choice at all, right? So the first one implies many choices. The second meaning of nothing implies no choice. So clearly not exactly the same meaning, and therefore, but the fact that it's the same word suckers you into thinking that there must be something to this argument. Now, why is this persuasive? Why do we get sucked into it? I think it's exactly because these subtle changes in word meaning do require attention, do require diligence as a listener, and so we get kind of, this is the bait in this particular thing that's on the hook that draws us in. Going back to this example. True. Well, the conclusion must be true as well. But obviously it's not. Some more just for comedic entertainment. I guess it's Pick on Bill Clinton Day today. If I were a single man, I might ask that mummy out. That's a good-looking mummy. Now, Bill Clinton, when he made those remarks, was looking at a mummified body, not as a person driving her minivan full of kids to a soccer game. Bill Clinton had a reputation for preferring the van type to the preserved bodies. That's neither here nor there. This example, equivocating on the word stealing. You can't take my products from my store, that's stealing. Well, you can steal in baseball. Right? Well, two different uses of the same word. Because stealing in baseball is allowed by the rules, whereas taking stuff from the store is not. By now, lots of you are getting concerned about the way these things are categorized. Now, as you're working on your papers, you are thinking, boy, these things are slippery. These fallacies are complicated. And I accept that criticism. I think you're exactly right. And in fact, I'm going to muddy the waters even a little bit more as a way of illustrating the complexity here. So I propose that there should be a fallacy of reverse equivocation. I've searched. I don't find it in any textbooks. I don't find it on any websites. Remember, we had accident and reverse accident for essentially hasty and sweeping generalizations. Well, there should be a reverse equivocation where, in fact, you're using different words to mean the same thing. So looking at the example below, we've got no difficulty with the recognition of civil unions for non-traditional relationships, but I believe in law we should protect the traditional definition of marriage. Well, that sounds like our former Prime Minister Harper is trying to be really nuanced and careful here. So I'm not prejudiced, but I don't want that. Now, the problem is that in Canada, civil unions is the same thing as marriage. And so by letting people think that those are two different things, allows him to kind of split the difference on this, what I think was probably at the time a complicated issue for him, where at least a lot of the people that voted for him would have had more discriminatory attitudes than he probably wanted to have himself. New example on this reverse equivocation. I guess I gotta now count this reverse equivocation as a correct answer on assignments and tests and so on. Well, that's exactly how complicated these informal fallacies are. Okay, so now notice you'd have to cite me because no one else is proposing this. So reverse equivocation. Here we have Trump saying universal mail-in voting, not absentee voting. Now, those are different words for exactly the same thing. And if you don't believe me, you can go to this discussion of the matter where a large number of constitutional experts were checked, and yeah, there is no difference between mailing balloting and absentee balloting. They are the same thing. And so now, why is he trying to make that distinction? Well, he's got complicated arguments he's trying to make about legitimacy and illegitimacy of the election that's happening in the United States. I think the position he's ultimately trying to take is that if you're a Republican, you're voting absentee, and if you're a Democrat, you're using mail-in voting, and that's exactly how I think this reverse equivocation is being exploited here. He's trying to pretend these are two different things where they are not. Equivocation is using the same word to mean two different things. Reverse equivocation, in my opinion, would be using two different words to talk about the same thing without letting on that they are the same thing. So, yeah, these informal fallacies are pretty imprecise. Remember, we are trying to categorize human error, and that's going to be rough, right? Man, the ways we can screw up are numerous and profound. And so the lesson I'm trying to, and I don't want to muddy the waters, I'm trying to introduce a teaching point, which is that the listing of these things is arbitrary and capricious, right? The way one author categorizes fallacies might be substantially different than the way another author categorizes them. A lot of the categorization goes straight back to Aristotle and how he did it, but not everyone agrees. Next fallacy, amphiboly, which is grammatical ambiguity on ambiguity on grammar or sentence construction. So just as an example of sentence construction, The panda eats shoots and leaves. Now, does that mean, is this sort of a sentence out of a biology book? Or is this a sentence from uh, some sort of Asian gang crime novel where the gang leader's nickname is the panda? Um, and he was in a restaurant and he didn't like his meal, so havoc was wreaked, right? The panda eats, shoots, and leaves. Could go both ways. So if you have grammatical ambiguity and you put that into an argument, then you have amphiboly. The most famous example is the obvious ambiguity about the U.S. Second Amendment, which states a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And if you drew from that the conclusion, therefore have a right to weapons without being part of a regulated militia, it's hard to see that that's completely justified. Um, it would have been really useful if the uh, folks who framed this statement had given us, quite frankly, some of our logic indicator words. Do they intend there to be, sorry, where's my point? Am I pointing here? Should there be a thus here? Or should it be and somewhere here? And because this sentence can go a couple different ways, that has been politically difficult for our neighbors to the south. There are certainly people who say, really, there's people who think that this sentence really starts here, right? And ignores the first part. So, you know, is the infringement the important part, or is it the well-regulated militia the important part of this sentence? I think that that's very, very interesting. A very famous example of amphiboly from Groucho Marx, who was a comedian of the early film era. One morning, I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got into my pajamas, I'll never know. Not quite an argument, definitely meant to be as a joke. Usually, the examples for this rely on classic literature. There was an ancient Greek tragedy that Aristotle quoted. A lot of people turn to this example from Shakespeare Macbeth. When Macbeth is told by the witches in the, I think it's the very beginning, none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. And Macbeth goes, hot dog, no one can harm me, because let's face it, you know, everyone comes from a woman. And so then you find out in the big climax of the play that someone wasn't born in a natural way, but rather born by cesarean section, who then, you know, runs them through. And so I don't think that it was really obvious that this born was the operative word in that first sentence. You know, certainly the way it's read is like none is the important part there. And so the born, are we talking, you know, a beak going from a uterus to outside, or are we talking being born in a natural sense of vaginal birth? You know, Macbeth found to his chagrin that it was the more narrow definition. This exact meme, of course, gets picked up in Lord of the Rings when the guy with the horny helmet there says, no man can kill me, and she rips off her helmet and says, I'm no man, and then runs him through, right? And that man thing, right? Are we talking humans or are we talking males? Is a, you know, is that an equivocation or is it an amphiboly? It usually depends exactly, often the deciding whether it's man or person is a little bit of contextual work, and so I'm inclined to treat them as amphiboles because it's the way the sentence is put together, even though it ends up being a single word that turns the meaning. So again, categorizing equivocation versus categorizing it as amphiboly. There's going to be lots of examples that are pretty much halfway in between. Like equivocation, these shifts in meaning are really rough, and often, especially when people speak, people don't say blah blah blah, comma blah blah blah, so you don't have any punctuation to help you out on that, and so the rift often sort of grammatical ambiguities are exploited to kind of dodge questions a little bit. So I've constructed this as an argument. You should give me your vote. So that's the conclusion. I am opposed to taxes that reduce economic activity. Now, sounds great, right? Now, some people say, yeah, I also am opposed to taxes if taxes, or opposed to specific taxes and those specific taxes that reduce economic activity. Or are we talking all taxes as taxes reduce economic activity, right? So are we talking some taxes or all taxes, right? Quite frankly, have to be pretty crazy to not oppose taxes that reduce economic activity. Problem is, do you think that's all taxes or just some? Right? So which is the operating phrase here? Which is it the modifier at the end, or is it the beginning part of it? This clipping from a newspaper of the time. Dean appears with his wife, Jimmy Carter. And, part of what's going on here, this might even be fit into our fallacy of accent in a moment, right? Where in fact the picture caption is in small print that we can't read. It looks from where we are that these words here modify the picture, where in fact there was a third person there. It wasn't that Jimmy Carter was married to the dean, or the dean was married to Jimmy Carter. Either way, right? Fallacy of accent. So let's go. This is when a shift in emphasis changes the truth value of statements. So just looking at shifts of emphasis for a minute, looking at the statement, I resent that letter, could also be pronounced as I resent that letter. Clearly, entirely different meanings depending on just how you pronounce that one word. So accent was a huge deal in the language in which Aristotle was categorizing fallacies, because in his language there was a relatively limited number of words that, depending on how they were said, could have vastly different meanings. In modern English, we have, quite frankly, way too many words. Those of you that are learning English as part of your studies, right? The vocabulary is crazy because we've stolen words from every language that the speakers of English have bumped into contact with. And so we often have, in some cases, 7 or 8 different words for the exact same thing. And so lots of our authors have argued that accent in English is not that big a deal. But let's think about it for a second. So thinking about we could say these two sentences in different ways. So all men are equal versus all men are equal, right? Where is, if the stress is on the men, that seems to leave out a gender. If the stress is on the all, that makes the interpretation of men as being inclusive way more plausible. And so that's my case for the fallacy of accent. This is something that's very hard. Accent is the way someone intends to say something, not obvious in written form, which is why we've invented emoticons when we suddenly went back to communicating via text, so that you knew when someone was being sarcastic versus when they were being serious. Um, and so we have, I think, that acknowledgement of that need for an interpretive guide to people's written work is a good evidence that the fallacy of accent is a real thing. That unless you know someone's being sarcastic, that's a really great idea, is very different than that's a really good idea. And so having a winky on the back end of that is pretty useful. Uh, the gentleman behind, Gary Curtis behind the fallacyfiles website that I so highly recommend. In fact, I'm going to email him and try to pitch him on this reverse equivocation thing. I've been back and forth with him a few times over the years. He's still not on board with me calling fallacy of abuse the Donald Trump fallacy, but um, I'll pitch him on this reverse equivocation thing. So he says that because ancient Greek was prone to accent shifts, modern English is not, that the fallacy of accent is a waste of time. I'm not entirely sure I buy that, but I appreciate his perspective on that. The standard modern language by Copy fallacy treatment, Copy includes emphasis on entire words as well as individual words. And so actually we flip back to that picture here for a second. This might seem to be exactly what Copy's talking about when he says fallacy of accent, emphasis on entire words, right? So in here, the actual photo caption, too small to read, which actually says who's in the picture, is overwhelmed by the very large typeface of the title of the story. And so from where we're looking at least, that seems to have more to do with the picture than the little caption does. That's emphasis on groups of words. Copy includes quoting out of context as a case of the fallacy of accent. So in 2009, when you guys were a little younger, a John McCain ad of the time, who is Barack Obama? Maybe that's a loaded question. He says our troops in Afghanistan are just air raiding villages and killing civilians, and then makes a claim about how dishonorable it is to say that. Now, here's what Obama actually said. Requires us to have enough troops so that we're not just air raiding villages and killing civilians. Well, leaving out the not, pretty important omission, I would argue. And so both I and I think Mr. Copy would argue that that is quoting out of context. And of course, by leaving out the not, you're sort of maximally de-emphasizing or reducing the accent on the not, right? Quite frankly, if you heard Obama say that, I bet the word he would punch the most would be that not, right? That would be the most emphasized word in that whole paragraph. To leave it out completely changes the meaning. And maybe this example illustrates why at your university level courses, your professors, including myself, are going to get kind of excited about appropriate sourcing of your materials, so that if there's any dispute about whether you fairly quoted someone or not, that can be arbitrated by going to your source. And when you quote something, you should endeavor to attempt to be fair. And by fair, of course, it's principle of charity, right? So this is exactly why bibliographic citation is important. You want anyone who's like, well, I'm not so sure Obama said that, or I'm not sure whatever historian in your history paper, scientist in your science paper, whoever, right? You want to say, well, if you don't believe me, go check. And you want to make sure that it's really there and that you haven't put any spin or twist on the original words. And so the principle of charity, you want to take the best version of the argument of the quote available, not something that's kind of sketchy. Now, the next two kind of go together. So we'll do composition and then division, but they're one. You could also say, composition and reverse composition. They are the flip sides of each other. So composition is when committed in the course of an argument, you confuse parts with wholes. And typically the form is given this way: x a part of y has property z, therefore y has a property z. So in an example, this new train locomotive has lightweight aluminum cup holders. So the cup holders have the property of being light. That does not mean that if you conclude, therefore, this locomotive is light, that's going to be rough, right? That's exactly composition. And composition is putting together. And so when you take a property of a part and it, so on the bottom level, things are made of all their parts. So if you take a property of a part, and attribute it to the whole, you're pulling together. That's composition. So for instance, as a counterexample, atoms are colorless. Cats are made of atoms, therefore cats are colorless. And if that were true, you wouldn't be able to see the little kitty there. And so the property of atoms is not a property of the cats. Why is this persuasive? We're so gullible. Oh my goodness. But exactly why is that there's an ambiguity between the way we talk about things. Sometimes we talk about things as groups. Sometimes we talk about things and we mean individuals. So two examples here. This airline will fly passengers millions of miles this year. That's something that an airline, well, if there were airlines, this is something they'd put in their brochure about how great they are. They're talking about passengers in their entirety, right? They're not flying one person millions of miles. It might be that they add up all the miles they fly, and that's millions of miles. Compare that to, this airline will serve passengers a light snack. Now you hope, times are tough, so they might try it, but you're hoping that they're going to give each passenger a light snack. So in that case, they're talking about passengers as individuals, not as a group. So they're using the same word to refer to two different very kinds of things. And that ambiguity of reference is what composition and division is all about. This is a classic way of giving sort of grumpy old man shutdowns of climate change theory. Every time, like today, it's a little gusty and cool, some person's going to say, oh, I thought global warming was a thing. And really what they're doing is they're confusing weather, which is a part of climate, with climate, right? So are you talking about a specific time on a specific day in a specific place, and how whether it's warm or cold? That's weather. When you talk about all the days and all the places and all the times, then you're talking about climate.